For most of American history, the line between medicine and something far stranger was thinner than anyone was willing to admit. And the people on the wrong side of that line were ordinary people, trusting ordinary institutions in perfectly ordinary moments. Tonight, we're going slowly through 99 true stories from American medical history that most classrooms never got around to covering. Get comfortable, let the blanket settle. This is going to be a long, quiet, genuinely strange night. 1. The cough syrup that wasn't quite innocent. There's a name you probably recognize from your medicine cabinet. Bayer. Aspirin, reliable, familiar. What most people don't know is that the same company, back in 1898, introduced another product to the American market with equally confident branding. That product was heroin. Not street heroin, commercial, over-the-counter, beautifully labeled heroin, sold in pharmacies right next to the soap. Bayer trademarked the name, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, which tells you something about the confidence of the marketing department. The product was positioned as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, which, in retrospect, is a little like selling a rainstorm as a cure for dampness. It was also specifically marketed as a children's cough syrup. Parents bought it, doctors recommended it, pharmacists stocked it without a second thought. Nobody was alarmed because the label said Bayer, and Bayer made aspirin, and aspirin was fine. And so the century began. 2. The soft drink with a complicated ingredient list. You've probably had a Coca-Cola at some point in your life, maybe today, maybe recently enough that this next part will feel a little personal. When John Pemberton invented his famous formula in 1886, the drink contained extract of coca leaves, which carried with it a small but real amount of cocaine. Contemporary advertisements described the beverage as invigorating and refreshing, which, given the ingredients, was not entirely inaccurate. The exact quantity of cocaine in each serving has never been confirmed. The Coca-Cola Company has never officially disclosed the original formula in full detail. What is known is that cocaine quietly disappeared from the recipe somewhere around 1903 without announcement or explanation. No press release, no label change, just a subtle reformulation and a move forward. Here's the thing. Pemberton himself had developed a morphine dependency during the Civil War and created the drink partly as a personal substitute. The history of American beverages is, occasionally, a medical history. 3. The toothache drops nobody questioned. Picture a family newspaper from the 1880s, advertisements for soap, flour, hats, and right there between the dry goods and the household announcements, a cheerful notice for Lloyd's cocaine toothache drops. Instant relief. Suitable for children, available at your local pharmacy. This was not unusual. Cocaine-based dental remedies were a normal feature of American consumer life throughout the late 1800s, sold with full approval from the regulatory predecessors of what would eventually become the FDA. The logic was straightforward by the standards of the time. Cocaine is a genuine local anesthetic, and it does numb pain effectively. That part was accurate. So, what wasn't discussed in the advertisements was the part that came after the numbness. Parents purchased these products the way they purchased anything else. Because they were on the shelf, because a trusted name was on the label, and because a child in pain needed something. The fact that those something included an addictive substance was simply not part of the conversation yet. It would take another decade before anyone thought to ask. 4. Schatz, the soothing syrup that was mostly not soothing. There is something quietly extraordinary about the name Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It sounds like something a grandmother would make from chamomile and warm milk. It sounds safe, gentle, helpful. Here's the thing. The active ingredient was morphine, sold freely in American pharmacies throughout the 1800s without a prescription, Mrs. Winslow's was marketed specifically to mothers with fussy babies as a reliable, calming agent. The formula also included alcohol, which added a secondary layer of sedation to what was already a fairly powerful combination. The product worked in the sense that babies who received it did in fact become quiet. The American Medical Association didn't formally object to products like this until 1912, which means decades passed during which this was simply what you gave a crying infant. Laudanum, the broader category of opium dissolved in alcohol, was considered a household staple across the country, shelved casually near the cooking supplies. The word soothing was doing a great deal of work on that label. 5. The licensed establishments nobody talks about San Francisco in the 1870s was a city of remarkable energy. Gold rush money, immigration, ambition, fog rolling in off the bay. It was also, by 1875, home to an estimated 200 licensed opium dens, all operating legally under city permits. This wasn't a secret underworld. It was a regulated, taxed, permitted industry. The way barbershops and boarding houses were regulated. Customers entered openly. Proprietors paid their fees. The city collected its revenue. Opium itself had been part of American life since the early 1800s. Present in medicine, in patents, in preparations sold at every pharmacy. The dens in San Francisco were simply a more visible, more social form of what was already widespread private consumption. The government's objection to opium, when it finally arrived, came decades later and was tangled up in politics and immigration policy in ways that had little to do with the pharmacology. But in 1875, on a San Francisco street, the sign above the door was perfectly legal. 6. The sleep aid that required very careful dosing chloroform has a particular quality to it, a heavy, sweet smell that literature and film have made almost romantic. In reality, chloroform is an extremely effective sedative with a dangerously narrow margin between the dose that makes you sleep and the dose that stops your breathing. Here's the thing. Through the middle 1800s, it was sold in American drugstores as a general sleep aid, available without a prescription, taken home in bottles, and self-administered by ordinary people with no medical training and no guidance on dosing. The Victorian era had a complicated relationship with sleep and nerves, and the remedies for both. Chloroform seemed like a modern solution, clean, chemical, scientific. The problem was that a little more could very quickly become a fatal amount, and there was no one at home to notice. Dosing errors were documented with uncomfortable frequency. So, the product remained available because regulation hadn't yet caught up with chemistry, and because most people who used it slept perfectly fine and woke up without incident. Most of them. 7. The year before labels were required. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act became law, and for the first time in American history, a manufacturer was legally required to tell you what was inside the bottle. That might sound like a low bar. It was. But it also means that everything before 1906, every tonic, syrup, cure, compound, and remedy sold to millions of Americans was completely unregulated in terms of ingredient disclosure. Manufacturers could put anything in a bottle in any amount. Arsenic, opium, turpentine, alcohol, lead, and they were under no legal obligation to mention any of it. The patent medicine industry of the 1800s was built entirely on this freedom. Labels described effects, relieves pain, restores vitality, cures nervousness, without ever naming the mechanism. Here's the thing about that era. The average American consumer was not unintelligent. They simply had no access to the information that would have let them make a different choice. The law that changed that came in 1906. It took that long. 8. The calming agents nobody regulated. By the time the American Medical Association formally condemned infant sedation products in 1912, the practice of giving babies alcohol and morphine preparations had been ongoing for the better part of a century. Soothing syrups came in many brands, many names, many carefully designed labels with soft colors and reassuring fonts. They shared a common formula, some combination of morphine, alcohol, sterilized, and occasionally cannabis, and a common purpose: to quiet a child quickly. Mothers were the target market, and the advertising spoke directly to the exhaustion of new parenthood. Here's the thing: the women purchasing these products weren't careless. They were doing exactly what the market, the pharmacy, and in many cases, the doctor told them to do. The information environment they lived in simply didn't include the concerns we'd consider obvious today. The AMA's 1912 condemnation marked a turning point, but by then the market had already shifted. Newer products were coming, and some of them would make the soothing syrups look cautious by comparison. 9. The cure for one addiction that created another. There is a particular kind of historical irony that arrives so neatly packaged, it seems almost invented. In the 1890s, Bayer marketed heroin specifically as a treatment for morphine addiction. The pitch was medically coherent on its surface. Heroin acts on the same receptors as morphine, produces a similar sedative effect, and could reduce withdrawal symptoms in patients trying to stop using morphine. What the marketing did not address was what happened after the morphine cravings were managed. Here's the thing: heroin is itself deeply habit-forming, and patients who successfully moved away from morphine dependency frequently found themselves dependent on the substitute. Thousands of people entered this cycle through completely legitimate medical channels, prescribed by doctors who trusted the Bayer literature and had no independent research to contradict it. The company's position was that heroin was safe and non-addictive. That position was stated with full confidence and absolutely no supporting evidence. And the prescriptions kept being written, one after another, across thousands of American pharmacies, all through the turn of the century. 10. The medicine cabinet staple that lasted 90 years. Cannabis tinctures appear in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official reference guide that tells American physicians and pharmacists what counts as a legitimate medicine, from 1851 all the way through 1942. That's 91 years of official recognition. During that stretch, cannabis was a standard pharmaceutical product, listed alongside aspirin and iodine and other staples. Doctors prescribed it for migraines, for cholera symptoms, for insomnia, for general nervous complaints. It came in small brown bottles, measured in drops, dispensed by pharmacists with the same professional care as anything else on the shelf. The gradual removal of cannabis from legal medicine in America was not driven primarily by medical evidence of harm. It arrived through a combination of political pressure, tax legislation, and cultural anxieties that had almost nothing to do with pharmacology. By 1942, the listing was gone, the tinctures disappeared from shelves, and the 91-year chapter in American pharmaceutical history quietly closed without much ceremony at all. If this is your first time on the channel, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. New episodes drop regularly, and they're made for exactly this kind of night. 11. Show, the riverbank treatment that sounds impossible. Along riverbanks in major American cities in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, there were small kits mounted in public, accessible locations for one specific emergency purpose: resuscitating drowning victims. The recommended procedure from medical authorities of the time included, among other interventions, the administration of tobacco smoke enemas. Specialized equipment existed for this purpose. The Royal Humane Society formally endorsed the practice. The logic was rooted in the medical understanding of the era. Stimulating the body with warmth and irritation might restart systems that had gone quiet. Here's the thing about historical medicine: it was almost never random. People were reasoning from evidence, applying the best frameworks they had, and trying to help. The frameworks were often wrong, but the intention was real. Tobacco smoke enemas faded from practice as anatomical knowledge advanced and as better resuscitation techniques emerged. They were replaced eventually by methods that worked. But for a window of time, the Riverbank kit was the state of the art, and nobody questioned it. 12. The legal prescription. During Prohibition. When Prohibition took effect in 1920, the manufacture and sale of alcohol became illegal in the United States, with one notable exception. Licensed physicians could legally prescribe medicinal whiskey to patients under the Volstead Act, and they did so with considerable enthusiasm. By 1928, American doctors were writing 11 million prescriptions per year for whiskey alone. Pharmacies stocked it. Drugstores dispensed it behind counters. Patients collected it with official documentation. The conditions for which whiskey was prescribed were creatively varied. Nervous exhaustion, heart weakness, digestive complaints, general debility. Here's the thing. The Volstead Act had created a situation where alcohol was simultaneously illegal and perfectly legal, depending entirely on whether a piece of paper accompanied it. Physicians who might have found the arrangement slightly ironic kept their thoughts to themselves and their prescription pads handy. The decade of Prohibition produced a thriving medical whiskey market that kept certain sectors of the healthcare economy doing quite well, right up until repeal arrived in 1933. 13. The decade when radiation was a wellness product. Sometime in the 1920s, radiation became fashionable. Not as a medical treatment for specific diseases, as a general wellness enhancement. The way people today talk about adaptogens or cold plunges. Hundreds of thousands of Americans purchased radium-containing products with genuine confidence that low-level radiation made the body stronger, more energetic, more vital. This was not a fringe belief held by a small group of eccentrics. It was mainstream consumer culture, supported by advertising in major publications, and endorsed by figures who held genuine authority. The scientific community had not yet fully understood the cumulative biological damage that radiation caused in human tissue. Marie Curie's work was celebrated without yet knowing what it would eventually cost her. In that gap between discovery and consequence, an entire consumer industry emerged. Products appeared on shelves at ordinary prices, in ordinary packaging, sold by ordinary businesses to ordinary people. The radium era is one of those chapters in American history where everything looks sensible until it suddenly doesn't. And the chapters that follow are where it stops looking sensible. 14. The bottled radiation sold as Sunshine Bailey Radium Laboratories in East Orange, New Jersey, manufactured a product called Radithor, distilled water containing measurable amounts of radioactive radium. The marketing described it as a cure for the living dead and perpetual sunshine, which, as taglines go, covered a remarkably wide range of conditions. Bailey sold over 400,000 bottles at $1 each, which in the 1920s represented a significant commercial operation. So, here's the thing about how it reached customers. It wasn't sold primarily in back alleys or through suspicious mail-order catalogs. It was recommended by physicians. Bailey paid doctors a commission for every bottle they prescribed, creating a financial incentive that moved legitimate medical professionals into the role of sales representatives for radioactive water. The doctors believed in the product. The patients trusted their doctors. And the bottles were small and elegantly labeled and sat on nightstands across America, consumed a little at a time in the sincere belief that they were doing something good. They were not doing something good. 15. The Amateur Golfer and the Wall Street Journal. Eben Byers was, by all accounts, a man of some distinction. A Pittsburgh socialite, an amateur golf champion, vigorous and social and well regarded in the circles he moved through. His doctor recommended Radithor following a minor injury, and Byers took to it enthusiastically. Over approximately 3 years, he consumed roughly 1,400 bottles. Here's the thing about what followed. It unfolded slowly, then all at once. Radium accumulates in bone tissue, where it continues to emit radiation for years. By 1931, Byers had lost significant weight. His jaw had deteriorated, and holes had formed in his skull as the bone dissolved from within. So, he died that same year. The Wall Street Journal covered the story with a headline that became one of the more memorable sentences in American medical journalism. The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off. That headline is remarkable because it is entirely accurate. Everything it describes actually happened. Eben Byers had been perfectly healthy before he started drinking Radithor, and then he wasn't, and then he was gone. 16. The toothpaste, with a radioactive ingredient. In the 1920s and into the 30s, certain toothpaste brands marketed to American and European consumers included radioactive thorium as an active ingredient. The product was promoted as a whitening and gum strengthening agent. Modern, scientific, effective. The branding leaned into the prestige of radiation as a concept, borrowing the cultural confidence that surrounded all things nuclear in that era. Here's the thing about thorium. Like radium, it accumulates in bone over time and causes damage that isn't visible until long after the exposure has ended. The people brushing with radioactive toothpaste twice a day were not doing so recklessly. They were following the packaging instructions. They were doing what the advertisement said to do. The toothpaste sat on bathroom shelves the way any other toothpaste sat on bathroom shelves. Used every morning, rinsed and replaced. The distance between "this is a trusted product" and "this contains radiation" was, for a window of time in American consumer history, almost non-existent. 17. The face cream that glowed. If you had visited a well-appointed American department store in the 1920s and made your way to the beauty counter, you might have found, among the powders and perfumes, a face cream infused with radium. It was positioned as a luxury item, a premium treatment promising youth, restoration, and a certain luminous quality. That luminous quality was, in a literal sense, accurate. The cream glowed faintly in the dark because it contained actual radium. This was considered a selling point. Here's the thing. Radium's association with glow, with energy, with vitality, made it aspirational. Women who purchased this cream were buying into a vision of modernity, of science applied to beauty, of progress bottled and available at the cosmetics counter. The damage radiation causes to skin tissue is slow and internal. It doesn't announce itself at the counter. It doesn't arrive with the receipt. The cream felt like luxury, smelled like beauty products typically smell, and its consequences were invisible until they were very much not. The glow faded long before the damage did. 18. So, the chocolate bar with an unusual ingredient. Radium's reach in the 1920s extended beyond water and toothpaste and face cream. It also found its way into confectionery. Chocolate bars containing small amounts of radioactive material were sold in both European and American markets during this period, with manufacturers claiming that trace radiation stimulated the immune system and improved digestion. The chocolate bar is perhaps the purest expression of the radium craze's cultural logic. If radiation was beneficial, and if people were already consuming radium in water and medicine, then wrapping it in chocolate simply made it more pleasant to take. The same reasoning that applied to vitamins applied, in the minds of the manufacturers, to low-level radioactive additives. Here's the thing about the 1920s relationship with radiation. It was almost entirely untested. The long-term biological effects of chronic low-dose exposure weren't understood. Enthusiasm ran ahead of evidence by a significant distance. The chocolate bars were sold, purchased, eaten, and enjoyed. The consequences of all of it would take years to surface, and by then the wrappers had long since been thrown away. 19. The home water treatment that glowed in the dark. for the domestic consumer who wanted the benefits of radium without the expense of Radithor or a trip to the beauty counter. There was another option, the radium emanator. These were ceramic crocks containing radium ore, designed to sit in a water pitcher overnight and energize the water inside. By morning, the user had a full pitcher of what the marketing described as revitalized, health-promoting drinking water, ready to consume with breakfast. These devices were endorsed by mainstream medical publications of the era, not fringe newsletters or dubious catalogs, but respected publications that gave the product a legitimacy that advertising alone couldn't have purchased. Families placed them on kitchen counters. They filled the pitchers each evening as part of their routine. Here's the thing about routines. They create comfort, familiarity, a sense of correctness. Nobody questions the thing they do every night before bed. The emanator sat quietly in the kitchen, doing what it did, and the family drank the water, and the mornings kept coming. And the routine held, and the questions never arrived. 20. The workers who painted in the dark. In the factories of the U.S. Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, workers, most of them young women, painted luminescent numbers onto watch dials using radium-based paint. The paint glowed, which made the watches useful in the dark, which made the watches desirable. Supervisors instructed the workers to lick their brushes to maintain a fine point, a technique called lip pointing, yutso, because it produced cleaner lines. Management at the company had access to research indicating that radium posed health risks. The workers did not have that information. Over time, the women developed serious health problems, damage to their jaw and bone structure, anemia, and conditions that had no precedent in occupational medicine at the time. More than 50 confirmed deaths were eventually attributed to their exposure. The case went to federal court in 1928 and became one of the first in which a corporation was held legally responsible for knowingly exposing workers to dangerous conditions. The Radium Girls, as they came to be known, changed American labor law. They did it at an enormous personal cost, and they did it without knowing that's what they were doing. 20 facts in, and here we are together in the quiet. If your eyes are getting heavy, that means everything's going exactly as it should. You're learning things slowly, gently, at the pace of a voice in the dark. There's no rush. History waited this long. It'll keep. Let your breathing slow down a little. The next chapter will be here when you're ready, or it'll still be here in the morning. Either way, you're doing beautifully. 21. The procedure that became a number between 1936 and the early 1960s. Somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 Americans received lobotomies. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Not as a shocking statistic, but as a reminder of scale. These were not isolated experiments conducted in obscure facilities. They happened in state hospitals, veterans hospitals, and private psychiatric institutions spread across all 48 states. Families consented because doctors recommended it. Doctors recommended it because the medical literature supported it. The medical literature supported it because the early results, measured by the standards of the time, looked promising. Here's the thing about psychiatric medicine in the 1930s. The options available were genuinely limited, and the suffering in those hospital wards was real and urgent. Physicians were looking for anything that worked. The lobotomy appeared for a time to offer something. Whether it delivered on that appearance is a question the decades that followed answered slowly and not particularly gently. The story of how it spread is where we go next. 22. The doctor with the van. Dr. Walter Freeman was, by any measure, a man of extraordinary energy. He performed over 3,500 lobotomies during his career, a number that required not just skill and speed, but a certain missionary commitment to the procedure he had helped popularize. When the demand in established hospitals began to slow, Freeman took his work on the road, traveling state to state in a vehicle he called the lobotomobile, He brought his instruments with him. He arranged demonstrations. He performed procedures in doctors' offices and clinical settings far outside major medical centers, bringing the surgery to places that wouldn't otherwise have had access to it. Here's the thing about Freeman's approach. He genuinely believed in what he was doing. His commitment wasn't cynical. He thought the procedure helped people, and he structured his entire professional life around delivering it as widely as possible. The question of whether his confidence was warranted is one that medical history has largely answered, but the sincerity behind it was real, and that sincerity is part of what made it so consequential. 23. The 10-minute procedure. The version of the lobotomy that Walter Freeman developed and popularized was designed for speed and accessibility. The transorbital approach used a slender ice pick-style instrument inserted through the eye socket, guided by a mallet, and moved in a specific pattern to sever connections in the frontal lobe. The entire procedure took approximately 10 minutes. Freeman performed it in clinical settings with an audience of medical students present, treating the demonstration as a teaching opportunity. He saw speed and accessibility as features. The procedure required no operating room, no general anesthesia, and minimal preparation time. Here's the thing about the way a procedure is packaged. It shapes how people receive it. A 10-minute intervention that could be performed in an office felt manageable in a way that major brain surgery did not. It lowered the threshold for consent. It made the decision feel smaller than it was. And because it felt manageable, it was offered more often to more patients in more circumstances than a longer or more complicated procedure ever would have been. 24. The record that nobody celebrated. There is a day in West Virginia that appears in the historical record without fanfare. The day Walter Freeman performed 25 lobotomies in a single session. He had been logging procedures at a pace that, by peak periods, averaged roughly one per day, but 25 in a single day is a different kind of number. It suggests an assembly line rhythm, a workflow optimized for throughput in a way that sits uncomfortably alongside the word surgery. Here's the thing. Institutional medicine in mid-century America was operating under enormous pressure. State psychiatric hospitals were overcrowded. Resources were stretched. Waiting lists were long. Administrators needed solutions that moved patients through the system efficiently. Freeman's procedure, fast and office-ready, fit that need in a way that longer, more resource-intensive treatments did not. The 25-in-a-day figure isn't just a curiosity. It tells you something about the environment that made it possible. An environment where speed and scale were not incidental to the procedure's appeal, but central to it. The next chapter puts a specific name to that pressure. 25. The Kennedy family's private grief. In 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was 23 years old. She had a mild intellectual disability and had been experiencing some behavioral difficulties, challenges that in another era might have been addressed through education, support, or simply patience. Her father arranged a lobotomy. The procedure left Rosemary unable to walk or speak properly, and she was placed in an institutional setting where she would live for the rest of her life. She died in 2005 at the age of 86. The Kennedy family did not speak publicly about Rosemary for many years. Her story remained private while her siblings achieved extraordinary public prominence. Here's the thing about the silence that surrounds a decision like this. It wasn't unique to one family. Many families across America made similar choices in similar circumstances, guided by similar advice from doctors who believed they were offering genuine help. The grief was widespread. The silence was common. What made Rosemary's story eventually public was the prominence of the name attached to it, not the rarity of what happened. 26. The insurance campaign nobody expected. Walter Freeman wasn't only a surgeon, he was also an advocate. a tireless promoter of the procedure he had built his career around. Among his various campaigns was an effort to have lobotomies covered by Blue Cross insurance, which would have made the procedure financially accessible to a much broader population. So, he also pushed for expanding the procedure's indications beyond psychiatric illness, advocating for its use in cases of hyperactivity in children and in adult men experiencing same-sex attraction, which at the time was classified as a psychiatric condition. Here's the thing about the range of conditions Freeman proposed to treat. It reveals how elastic the concept of medical necessity can become when a procedure gains institutional momentum. Once a treatment earns legitimacy, the boundaries of its application tend to expand. Each new category feels like progress at the time. Freeman believed in each one, and the expansion of those categories, unchecked by adequate evidence, is one of the quieter lessons the lobotomy era left behind, sitting patiently in the historical record. 27. The institutional math behind the surgery. State psychiatric hospitals in the mid-20th century were not small, quiet facilities. They were enormous institutions, some housing several thousand patients in buildings designed for far fewer. Funding was chronically insufficient. Staffing ratios were strained. A ward full of agitated, distressed, behaviorally unpredictable patients required constant attention and significant resources. A ward full of calm, passive, compliant patients required far less. So, here's the thing that becomes clear when you look at who championed the lobotomy. Hospital administrators were among its most enthusiastic supporters. Not because they had reviewed the outcome data carefully, because the procedure, whatever it did neurologically, tended to produce patients who were easier to manage. The surgery addressed a staffing problem as much as it addressed a psychiatric one. That's not an accusation of bad faith. It's an observation about the way institutional incentives shape medical decisions. The pressure those administrators were under was real. The solution they embraced was available. And the two facts found each other, the way institutional pressure and convenient solutions tend to do. 28. The Nobel Prize that stayed in 1949, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Antonio Egas Moniz, Rus, the Portuguese neurologist who had developed the original lobotomy procedure. The prize recognized what was, at the time of the award, considered a genuine medical advancement. By the time the procedure was being widely reconsidered in the 1950s and condemned by the 1960s, the prize had already been given. It was never rescinded. It remains to this day on the books. Here's the thing about that. The Nobel Committee, like the physicians who adopted the procedure, was working with the evidence available at the time of the decision. Hindsight makes the award look strange. But scientific prizes are given based on contemporary understanding, not future revision. The lobotomy story is, in part, a story about how completely a procedure can appear to succeed before the long-term results arrive to complicate the picture. The prize sits in the historical record as a marker of that gap between early confidence and later understanding. 29. The coma that was called a cure. Insulin shock therapy arrived in American psychiatric hospitals in the late 1930s and spread with remarkable speed. The treatment involved injecting patients with large doses of insulin, driving blood sugar low enough to induce a state of unconsciousness. The logic was that the coma and the recovery from it might somehow reset neurological patterns associated with severe mental illness. By 1941, the procedure was practiced in 72% of American psychiatric hospitals. Here's the thing. No controlled clinical trial had ever demonstrated that it worked. The adoption outpaced the evidence by a significant margin. Physicians observed patients who appeared calmer after treatment and attributed the change to the therapy. Other explanations, including the simple effect of intensive one-on-one nursing care that accompanied the procedure, were not systematically ruled out. The treatment continued for years before careful studies began to question it. When those studies arrived, the picture they painted was not encouraging, but by then, the therapy had already passed through tens of thousands of patients. 30. The treatment that left marks. Metrazole shock therapy preceded electroconvulsive therapy in American psychiatric medicine and worked by injecting a chemical that induced rapid, intense convulsions. The convulsions were severe, so severe that in one documented study at a New York institution, vertebral fractures occurred in 43% of patients who received the treatment. That figure was documented. It was published. It was available to the physicians who continued administering the therapy after the study appeared. Here's the thing about that continuity. It wasn't indifference to suffering exactly. It was the weight of institutional momentum against a backdrop of very few alternatives. Psychiatric medicine in that era was genuinely trying to find tools that worked. Metrazole caused harm, but it also, in some patients, appeared to relieve symptoms. The calculus was brutal and imprecise. Physicians were making decisions with incomplete information in overcrowded wards, under pressure to produce results. The fractures kept happening. The therapy kept being administered. And the search for something better kept going slowly through the difficult middle decades of American psychiatric history. 31. The doctor who blamed the teeth. Henry Cotton became superintendent of Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey in 1907 and held the position for more than 2 decades. He developed and championed a theory that mental illness was caused by hidden bacterial infections lurking in various parts of the body. His treatment approach followed logically from that theory. Remove the potential infection sites. This began with teeth and tonsils and expanded, in more severe cases, to include colons, gallbladders, and other internal organs. Cotton's patient mortality rate was significantly higher than comparable institutions. Investigations were conducted. Here's the thing about those investigations. They did not result in professional sanction. Cotton retained his position and his reputation within certain circles for years. His theory had a surface plausibility that made it difficult for contemporaries to dismiss outright, and he published his results in ways that emphasized his successes. The story of Henry Cotton is uncomfortable not because he was obviously reckless, but because the system around him found so many reasons, for so long, to look past the outcomes. 32. Scheidt, the doctor who operated on a grand scale. John Brinkley built one of the most unusual medical empires in American history on a single persistent idea. That goat gland tissue, surgically implanted into a man, could restore vitality and vigor. He began performing these operations in the 1920s, charged $750 per procedure, and over the course of his career performed an estimated 16,000 operations. He became wealthy enough to own a yacht, multiple properties, and a radio station. He ran for governor of Kansas twice. Here's the thing about Brinkley's appeal. He was an extraordinarily effective communicator. His radio broadcasts reached enormous audiences, and he spoke directly to anxieties about aging and health that were entirely real, even if his treatment for those anxieties was not. People believed him because he was confident, accessible, and seemingly successful. The operations caused serious complications, and confirmed deaths were documented. The American Medical Association opposed him loudly. Brinkley moved his practice to Texas and continued undeterred for years. Confidence, it turns out, travels well. 33. The state line that changed nothing. When the American Medical Association succeeded in having John Brinkley's medical license revoked in Kansas, the outcome might have looked like a conclusion. It was not. Brinkley relocated to Del Rio, Texas, established a new operation just across the Mexican border, and continued both his medical practice and his radio broadcasting from a transmitter so powerful it could be heard across much of North America. His patient numbers didn't collapse. His reputation among his followers didn't dissolve. Here's the thing about regulatory boundaries in the early 20th century. They were jurisdictional in ways that a determined and resourceful individual could navigate without too much difficulty. Shui, a license revoked in one state didn't automatically affect another. A transmitter on the other side of a national border operated outside U.S. broadcast regulations entirely. Brinkley understood the geography of oversight and used it fluently. His story ended eventually in bankruptcy and legal collapse, but the collapse came from financial and legal pressures rather than from medicine catching up with him. He practiced for years after Kansas said no. 34. The animal grafts nobody talked about. While Brinkley was operating in Kansas, a parallel phenomenon was unfolding in Europe and filtering back into American medical culture. Xenotransplantation experiments involving animal gland tissue grafted onto human patients. In Paris, men paid for procedures involving primate testicular tissue, promoted as treatments for sexual dysfunction and general male decline. Some patients were not fully informed about the animal origin of the material being grafted into their bodies. Complications were frequent. Here's the thing about these procedures. They weren't taking place in back rooms. They were offered by physicians in clinical settings, in major cities, for significant fees. The science behind them was speculative at best, but the cultural anxiety they were designed to address was entirely genuine. The fear of aging, of diminished vitality, of losing physical capacity, these are enduring human concerns. Medicine has always found ways to offer something in response to them, whether or not that something works. The animal graft era was an extreme expression of that tendency, and it passed. But the tendency it reflected did not pass with it. 35. The blood substitute that wasn't in the late 19th century. A small number of American physicians experimented with milk as a substitute for blood in patients who had suffered severe blood loss. The reasoning was loosely biological. Milk is a fluid produced by mammals. It contains proteins and fats. And in an era before blood typing or transfusion technology existed, it seemed like it might offer something to a patient who was dying for want of volume in their circulatory system. Here's the thing. Milk introduced into the bloodstream does not behave like blood. It causes severe immune reactions, clotting, fever, and systemic failure. The procedure killed the majority of patients who received it. It was attempted only a small number of times before the outcomes made further experimentation untenable. The doctors who tried it were not indifferent to results. They were desperate, and the patients they were trying to save were already in critical condition. The milk transfusion is a chapter that closed quickly, overtaken by evidence before it had time to become widespread. Not every wrong turn in medical history lasted long. Some were short, sharp, and conclusive. 36. The treatment that outlasted its evidence. Bloodletting. The deliberate removal of blood from a patient's body as a medical treatment was practiced in America from the colonial era well into the 1830s, making it one of the longest-running therapeutic traditions in the country's history. The underlying framework was ancient. An imbalance in the body's humors caused disease, and removing excess blood restored equilibrium. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a foundational figure in American medicine, was one of its most passionate advocates. Here's the thing about a treatment that persists for generations. It accumulates a kind of institutional gravity that makes it very difficult to dislodge. Physicians who had trained using bloodletting, who had watched their teachers use it, who had seen patients survive after it, were not wrong to trust their experience. Their experience was real. The framework through which they interpreted it was not. The history of bloodletting is partly a story about how long a flawed theory can sustain itself when it's embedded deeply enough in professional culture and passed sincerely from teacher to student. 37. The epidemic and the Doctor Who doubled down. In 1793, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia, killing thousands in a city that was then the largest and most important in America. Benjamin Rush treated patients during that outbreak using aggressive bloodletting and purging, removing large volumes of blood, and administering powerful laxatives in combination. His patients did not fare well compared to those treated by physicians who used more conservative approaches or no treatment at all. Rush attributed the poor outcomes not to the treatment, but to insufficient application of it. Here's the thing about that response. It's not as strange as it sounds. When a theory is deeply held and a treatment has the weight of authority behind it, evidence that contradicts it often gets absorbed into the existing framework rather than dismantling it. Rush was an intelligent, dedicated physician by the standards of his time. His commitment to his patients was genuine. His framework for understanding what helped them was wrong, and the sincerity of his commitment didn't change that. Philadelphia recovered. Rush continued practicing and writing, certain he had done his best. He probably had. 38. The metal that was also medicine, mercury, had a long career in American medicine that covered more conditions than most modern pharmaceuticals dare to claim. Through the 1800s, it was prescribed for syphilis, constipation, depression, and as a teething remedy for children, a range that says something about how broadly it was trusted. It worked, in a limited sense, against certain bacterial infections. Here's the thing about mercury at therapeutic doses. The side effects were substantial. Hair and teeth could be lost. Kidneys could sustain damage. Tremors could develop. The line between a dose that treated and a dose that harmed was narrow, and physicians of the era didn't have the tools to monitor it precisely. Some patients died from the treatment rather than from whatever brought them to the doctor's office. So, mercury persisted in medical use for so long, partly because syphilis was genuinely difficult to treat, and partly because the damage it caused was gradual enough to be attributed to other causes. The body keeps records that medicine sometimes takes a long time to read correctly. Mercury's chapter in American medicine closed slowly, and not entirely without cost. 39. The last country to say goodbye. Heroin was sold without a prescription in American drugstores until the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 imposed the first federal controls on opiates. Even after that, licensed physicians continued prescribing heroin legally for another decade. The United States didn't fully prohibit its medical use until 1924, making it one of the last major industrialized nations to do so. So, here's the thing about that timeline. It wasn't negligence exactly. It was the accumulated weight of a medical culture that had incorporated opiates so thoroughly into its practice that removing them required not just a law, but a complete restructuring of how pain, coughing, and nervous complaints were treated. Physicians who had been prescribing heroin for 20 years needed an alternative, several alternatives actually, for the many conditions that heroin had been used to address. The regulatory change came with genuine disruption to established medical practice. The drugs didn't disappear from American life when the prescription stopped. They simply moved to different channels, and the channels they moved to were considerably less regulated than the pharmacies had been. 40. The reviewer who said no thalidomide was a sedative marketed in Europe and parts of the world as a safe treatment for morning sickness during pregnancy. 3. It caused severe birth defects in approximately 10,000 children. It was never approved for sale in the United States. That outcome was not automatic. The drugs manufacturers applied for U.S. approval, submitted their data, and expected to enter what was then one of the world's largest pharmaceutical markets. Here's the thing about what stood between thalidomide and American pharmacy shelves. One person, Francis Kelsey, an FDA reviewer, came. When the birth defect reports came, when the birth defect reports emerged from Europe, the U.S. was largely spared. Kelsey received the President's Distinguished Federal Civilian Service Award in 1962, one of the highest honors available to a federal employee. The history of American medicine contains many stories about things that went wrong. Francis Kelsey is one of the stories about a thing that didn't. because one careful person refused to be rushed. 40 chapters. You've traveled a long way tonight through some genuinely strange corners of American history, and if you're still with us, you've earned a slow breath. Feel the weight of wherever you're lying down. Let your shoulders drop a little. The next chapter will be there whenever you're ready, or maybe you'll find it waiting for you tomorrow, patient as history always is. 41. The surgery that required no operating room. There's a particular kind of medical story where the innovation itself is genuinely impressive and the application of it becomes the complicated part. Hydrotherapy in American psychiatric hospitals occupies that uncomfortable space. The treatment involved immersing patients in water, sometimes very cold, sometimes kept at a sustained temperature for extended periods, as a way of managing severe agitation or distress. The logic drew on real physiological principles. Water temperature affects the nervous system, and immersion produces measurable changes in heart rate and alertness. Here's the thing about how hydrotherapy was actually administered in institutional settings. The gap between the theory and the practice was wide. Documented cases describe patients held in baths for hours, sometimes longer, in conditions that went well beyond therapeutic intention. The treatment existed on a spectrum, and the ends of that spectrum looked very different from each other. What began as a genuine attempt to find non-chemical interventions for psychiatric distress became, in certain facilities, something that the patients who experienced it would not have described as care. 42. The surgeon whose legacy got complicated. James Marion Sims is remembered in medical history as the physician who developed a surgical repair for vesicovaginal fistula, a condition that caused enormous suffering for women, often following complicated childbirth, and for which there had previously been no reliable treatment. He developed his technique through years of careful surgical experimentation in Alabama between 1845 and 1849. So, here's the thing about how that knowledge was built. The women on whom he practiced were enslaved, and they were operated on without anesthesia, under a medical theory of the time that held, without scientific basis, that certain patients experience pain differently. The technique he eventually perfected was genuinely valuable and has benefited enormous numbers of women across many generations. Shui, the circumstances under which it was developed, are now a central part of how historians and medical ethicists discuss his legacy. His statue was removed from New York's Central Park in 2018. Both things, the medical contribution and the ethical questions surrounding it, are part of the same historical record, and neither cancels the other out entirely. 43. The 60,000 Americans. Nobody counted between 1907 and the 1970s. An estimated 60,000 to 65,000 Americans were sterilized under state eugenics laws, procedures performed without their knowledge or meaningful consent, in hospitals, prisons, and institutions across the country. California was responsible for more than 20,000 of those sterilizations, the highest total of any state. The targets were disproportionately women, people with disabilities, and individuals from low-income communities. Here's the thing about the scale of this. It wasn't a secret program run by a small group of extremists. It was law. Statutes were passed by elected legislatures, administered by state institutions, and carried out by licensed physicians. The legal and scientific frameworks supporting the program were published, cited, and widely accepted within certain professional circles of the era. Understanding it as institutional history rather than individual villainy is important, because the lesson it carries is about systems, about what happens when a flawed idea acquires legal authority and the infrastructure to act on it, one patient at a time. 44. The Supreme Court case that never left the books. In 1927, the Supreme Court of the United States decided a case called Buck versus Bell. in which the forced sterilization of a young Virginia woman named Carrie Buck was challenged on constitutional grounds. The court ruled in favor of the state, upholding the sterilization statute by a vote of 8-1. The majority opinion held that the state had a legitimate interest in preventing the reproduction of individuals deemed unfit, a conclusion reached without adequate scrutiny of the scientific claims underlying it. Here's the thing about Buck versus Bell. It was never overturned. Subsequent decisions narrowed its application significantly, and no court has enforced it in the way it was used in 1927. But it remains technically valid precedent, sitting quietly in American constitutional law. Carrie Buck was not, by any subsequent assessment, the person the court's opinion described her as being. She read, she corresponded, she lived an ordinary life after her institutionalization ended. The record caught up with the case. The case, however, never quite caught up with the record. 45. The industry that named itself, carefully. The term patent medicine sounds official. It sounds like something that has been reviewed, registered, and approved, stamped with the seal of some authority that checked the contents and found them satisfactory. Here's the thing. Most patent medicines were never actually patented. Manufacturers kept their formulas deliberately secret because a patent required public disclosure of ingredients, and public disclosure of ingredients might alarm customers or invite competition. True, the word patent in the name referred loosely to a royal patent of an earlier era and carried connotations of legitimacy that the products had not earned through any formal process. The industry understood the power of language. Names that sounded medical, scientific, or officially endorsed moved product far more effectively than honest descriptions would have. A bottle called alcohol, opium, and flavoring syrup would have struggled in the marketplace. The same contents, labeled with a physician's name, a reassuring claim, and a confident typeset, sold millions of units across decades. The gap between the name and the reality was the entire business model, and it worked exceptionally well for a very long time. 46. The rust in the bottle. Among the more enduring patent medicines of the 19th century was a product called Dr. Williams's Pink Pills for Pale People, a name so confidently alliterative it almost sounds invented. It was not invented. It was real, widely purchased, and one of the best-selling patent remedies of its era. The active ingredient was iron oxide, that is to say, rust. Finely processed, encapsulated rust. Here's the thing. Iron oxide is without physiological relevance. Iron deficiency anemia is a genuine condition, and supplemental iron does help people who have it. Dr. Williams's pink pills probably did provide genuine relief to customers who were mildly iron deficient, which in an era of limited dietary variety was not a trivial population. The product's claims extended well beyond anemia, however, encompassing nervous disorders, paralysis, and general debility, conditions for which iron oxide had nothing meaningful to offer. It worked for one thing, claimed credit for many others, and sold steadily for decades because the one thing it helped with was common enough to generate a reliable stream of satisfied customers. Results may have varied. The marketing did not waver. 47. The wine that called itself medicine. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound was one of the most widely recognized products in American consumer life through the late 1800s. It was sold in elegant bottles, marketed with a warm and maternal portrait of Lydia Pinkham herself on the label, and positioned specifically as a remedy for conditions affecting women. Nervous complaints, irregular cycles, general weakness. The compound promised botanical relief from the particular physical challenges of womanhood, and American women purchased it in enormous quantities. Here's the thing about what was actually in the bottle. The primary active ingredient was alcohol, present at concentrations between 18 and 20%. That placed it comfortably in the range of a fortified wine. The botanical ingredients were real, but pharmacologically modest. The compound was, in effect, short opera medicinal wine sold to women at a time when women drinking wine socially carried significant cultural stigma, while women taking medicine did not. Lydia Pinkham solved that problem elegantly by being both things at once, and the market responded with decades of loyal purchasing. The bottles kept selling long after Lydia herself had passed. 48. The temperance advocate's favorite medicine, Peruna, was the best-selling patent medicine in America in the early 1900s, marketed as a catarrh cure. Catarrh being a broadly defined condition involving inflammation of the mucous membranes that encompassed enough symptoms to apply to almost anyone on any given day. The formula contained 28% alcohol. Here's the thing that makes Peruna's success particularly memorable. It was purchased in especially large quantities by members of the temperance movement, the organized effort to eliminate alcohol from American life. These were individuals who had committed publicly and often fervently to the position that alcohol was destructive and immoral. They purchased Peruna because it was labeled medicine, not liquor, and the label made the contents acceptable in a way that a bottle of spirits was not. Whether they were aware of the discrepancy varied by individual. Whether Peruna's manufacturers were aware of their customer base is considerably less ambiguous. The catarrh cure market and the temperance geography overlapped in ways that anyone paying attention could have noticed. The irony traveled quietly inside every bottle. 49. The newspapers that agreed to stay quiet. Advertising revenue is a powerful thing, and in the 1880s and 90s, the patent medicine industry was spending more on newspaper advertising than any other industry in America. That money came with an expectation, and in many cases, a formal contractual obligation. Newspapers that accepted patent medicine advertising agreed not to publish negative coverage of the medicine industry. The agreement wasn't always written down. Sometimes it was simply understood. Here's the thing about that arrangement. It shaped what American readers knew and didn't know about the products in their medicine cabinets for decades. A free press is only as free as its financial independence allows it to be, and the press of that era was deeply financially entangled with the industry it might otherwise have investigated. Readers who trusted their newspapers were, through no fault of their own, receiving an edited version of reality. The medicine industry purchased not just advertising space, but a kind of protective silence, and the silence held for years. It took a different kind of writer with a different kind of backing to finally break it. 50. The investigation that changed the law. Samuel Hopkins Adams spent months in 1905 building a case. He investigated the patent medicine industry for Collier's Weekly and produced a 12-part series called The Great American Fraud. A careful, identified narcotics in products marketed to children. He named names. Here's the thing about what happened after the series ran. It worked. The public response was significant enough to provide political momentum for legislation that had been stalled for years. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which required ingredient labeling for the first time in American history, was directly accelerated by Adams' reporting. The series is one of the clearer examples in American history of journalism producing concrete legal change. Adams won a Pulitzer Prize. The patent medicine industry contracted, reorganized, and adapted. It didn't disappear, but it became something that at least had to tell you what was in the bottle. That was, by the standards of what came before, an enormous step. If this documentary is helping you drift off, consider subscribing and leaving a comment. It helps more people find their way here, and there's always more history waiting in the dark. 51. The law that only went halfway. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a genuine milestone. The first federal law in American history requiring that the contents of food and medicine be labeled accurately. that was meaningful and new. So here's the thing about what the law did not require: proof that the product worked. A manufacturer could label a bottle honestly and still claim on that label that the product cured cancer, treated paralysis, or restored youth as long as the ingredient list was accurate. The law addressed fraud in labeling. It did not address fraud in medical claims. Patent medicines reformulated, relabeled, and continued making extraordinary therapeutic promises from their honestly printed ingredient lists. So, the industry had been significantly disrupted, but not fundamentally dismantled. The next layer of regulation, requiring safety testing before sale, wouldn't arrive until 1938. The layer after that, requiring proof of effectiveness, wouldn't arrive until 1962. Each gap between laws represents a window of time during which products that didn't work were sold to people who needed something that did. 52. The word a company invented before 1921, halitosis, was not a household concern. It was a medical term, clinical, distant, the kind of word that appeared in textbooks rather than in conversations. Listerine had been on the American market since the 1880s, initially as a surgical antiseptic and, in various formulations, as a floor cleaner and a remedy for gonorrhea. None of those applications had made it a commercial success. Here's the thing about what happened when the company decided to market directly to social anxiety. The campaign invented the problem it was solving. By bringing halitosis out of the medical dictionary and into advertising copy, Listerine created a condition that millions of Americans suddenly feared they had, and then offered the solution on the next shelf. Sales increased 7,000% within a decade. The strategy is now a foundational case study in marketing history. Taught in business schools as an example of manufactured demand, the product worked well enough as a mouthwash. The genius wasn't the formula, it was the decision to make ordinary breath feel like a social emergency that required immediate chemical intervention. 53. The man who invented the drink for himself. John Pemberton was a pharmacist and a veteran of the Civil War, who had developed a dependency on morphine following injuries sustained during the conflict. He spent years searching for a substitute, something that could address the same cravings through a different mechanism. His experiments produced several products before he arrived at the formula that would eventually become Coca-Cola. Here's the thing about the origin story that usually gets told. It tends to focus on the entrepreneurial aspect, the refreshment angle, the accidental genius of the combination. What it less often emphasizes is that Pemberton was, at his core, a man in pain trying to manage that pain with the tools available to him. He was self-medicating carefully and deliberately, using the chemical knowledge he had. The drink he created eventually became one of the most recognized products in human history. The man who created it was trying to get through his days with less suffering than he'd been carrying. That's a more human story than the legend usually has room for, and it changes the flavor of the history slightly. 54. Show the 56-year gap. The Food and Drug Administration has existed in various forms since 1906. But the FDA that most people imagine, the agency with authority to pull dangerous products from shelves and demand that medicines prove their safety, didn't fully exist until much later. The power to require safety testing before a drug could be sold didn't arrive until the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. Efficacy testing, requiring that a drug actually work before it could be marketed, wasn't mandated until 1962. Here's the thing about that timeline. Between 1906 and 1962, 56 years passed during which the FDA could largely only respond after harm had already occurred. The 1938 law came after a sulfanilamide preparation mixed with a toxic solvent killed 107 people. The 1962 amendment came in the wake of the thalidomide crisis in Europe. Both expansions of regulatory authority required a catastrophe to become politically possible. The agency grew in response to failures it hadn't been given the tools to prevent. That's a difficult way to build a system, and it took a long time. 55. The 4,000 experiments between 1944 and 1974 show the United States government conducted or directly sponsored at least 4,000 experiments involving radiation on American civilians. Most of the subjects were patients in public hospitals. Most were not told they were participating in a research program. Most believed they were receiving standard medical care. Here's the thing about how this became possible. It happened in the space between institutional authority and individual knowledge. Patients trusted hospitals. Hospitals trusted government-funded researchers. Researchers operated within a classified program that insulated them from the kind of scrutiny that might have slowed or stopped the work. The subjects had no way to ask the right questions because they didn't know the right questions existed. That gap between what institutions know and what individuals are told is one of the recurring conditions that made this era of American medical history possible. The experiments were diverse in method and location. They shared a common feature. The people at the center of them didn't know they were there. That chapter of the story continues in a very specific case. 56. The 18 people who didn't know. In 1945, 18 patients at hospitals across the United States, in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and Oak Ridge, were injected with plutonium as part of a classified government research program. None were informed about the nature of what was being administered. The program was designed to study how plutonium behaved in the human body, information that was considered essential to the government's understanding of radiation exposure in the context of nuclear weapons development. Here's the thing about the patient population selected. Most had serious illnesses, some terminal, but not all. The selection criteria were inconsistent, and at least some subjects were chosen based on availability and access rather than strict medical criteria. Consent, as it is understood today, was absent. The patients were in hospitals because they were sick and needed help. What they received was something else entirely, administered without their knowledge by people who had determined, at an institutional level, that the research value outweighed the individual's right to know what was entering their body. So, the next chapter puts a name and a life to one of those 18. 57. The man who outlived the diagnosis. Albert Stevens was a house painter from California who entered a San Francisco hospital in 1945 with what his doctors believed was terminal stomach cancer. He was selected for the plutonium injection program on that basis, the assumption being that a terminally ill patient's remaining time was already limited. Here's the thing about what happened next. Stevens did not have cancer. He had a benign ulcer. The diagnosis was wrong, the prognosis was wrong, and the man who had been treated as a terminal patient went home and lived for another 21 years. He died in 1966 from heart disease, at which point researchers studying his case determined he had absorbed the highest radiation dose ever recorded in a human being and survived it. Stevens himself never knew the full details of what he had been given in that hospital. He lived his life painting houses and going about his days without knowing that he had become, involuntarily, a data point in a classified government study. His survival was remarkable. The circumstances of his participation were not something he consented to, and he died before the program was made public. 58. The science club that wasn't in the 1950s and 1960s, Chaois, or researchers affiliated with the Atomic Energy Commission, conducted a study at a Massachusetts state school for children with intellectual disabilities. They wanted to understand how the body absorbed nutrients, specifically iron and calcium, and they used radioactive tracers to track that absorption. To enroll children in the study, parents received letters informing them that their sons were being invited to join a special science club and would receive improved nutritional monitoring as participants. Here's the thing about what the letters did not say. They did not disclose that the improved nutrition included radioactive materials. Parents who consented believed they were agreeing to something resembling an enrichment program. The children involved were residents of a state institution, chart, which meant their parents had significantly less access to them and less ability to observe what was actually happening day to day. The study produced data. It was published in scientific journals. The ethical questions it raised weren't surfaced publicly for decades. When they were, the gap between what parents were told and what their children experienced became a significant part of the historical accounting. 59. The cities that didn't know they were test sites. Between 1953 and 1965, the U.S. Army conducted a series of open-air experiments in American cities, designed to study how airborne particles dispersed through urban environments. The research was framed as preparedness work, understanding how a biological or chemical agent might spread through a city in the event of an attack. Cities including St. Louis and Minneapolis were among the locations selected. Residents were not informed. Here's the thing about the St. Louis experiments specifically. Subsequent analysis of the targeting data showed that the dispersal tests were conducted disproportionately over low-income neighborhoods and public housing projects. Researchers later identified patterns suggesting that these areas were deliberately chosen rather than selected at random. The Army maintained that the materials dispersed were inert and harmless. Independent researchers who reviewed the records decades later raised questions about that characterization. The full picture remains contested in some details, but the core fact is not. American cities were used as open-air laboratories without the knowledge or consent of the people living in them. The relationship between institutional authority and individual awareness runs through this entire era like a quiet current. 60. The bacteria released over San Francisco, Operation Sea Spray, took place in 1950 when the U.S. Navy released bacteria from vessels positioned off the coast of San Francisco into the Bay Area's wind patterns. The goal was to study how a biological agent would travel through an urban environment, information relevant to both offensive and defensive military planning during the early Cold War period. The bacteria used were considered at the time to be harmless to healthy people. Here's the thing about that assessment. Shortly after the operation, a previously healthy man at a San Francisco hospital developed a serious infection caused by one of the same bacterial strains that had been released. He died. Whether the release directly caused his death has been debated, but the timing and the pathogen match were documented and reviewed. The Navy did not disclose the operation publicly until years later, when congressional investigations into government testing programs brought it to light. Operation Sea Spray is one of dozens of similar experiments from that era, each one a quiet reminder that the Cold War's impact on American life extended well beyond the diplomatic and military theaters most history books describe. 60 chapters. You've covered more American medical history tonight than most people encounter in a lifetime, and you've done it lying down, which feels like the right way to absorb all of this. If your thoughts are getting slower and softer around the edges, that's perfectly fine. That's the point. The next chapter will be here whenever you surface. No rush at all. 61. The soldiers who stood near the blast. Between 1946 and 1963, at least 2,300 American soldiers were deliberately positioned near atomic weapons test sites as part of a program designed to study the psychological and physiological effects of nuclear warfare on military personnel. Some were placed in trenches close to detonation points. Others were flown through radioactive clouds in the aftermath of explosions. The men were told they were performing their duty. They were not told the full nature of what they were being exposed to. Here's the thing about the program's stated purpose. It was genuinely military in its logic. Commanders needed to understand how troops would function in a nuclear battlefield, how fear and disorientation would affect combat effectiveness, and what physical proximity to a detonation meant for a soldier's ability to keep moving. Those were real questions with real strategic stakes. The answers were gathered at a real human cost, paid by men who had enlisted to serve their country and found themselves, without full knowledge, serving as data points in a radiological study. Their service was real. What they were told about it was incomplete. 62. The cancer patients and the Cold War. Question at the University of Cincinnati between 1960 and 1971. A research program funded by the Department of Defense exposed more than 80 cancer patients to high doses of full-body radiation. The doses administered went significantly beyond what would have been considered therapeutic for their conditions. The patients were predominantly from low-income backgrounds. Here's the thing about what the research was actually designed to answer. It wasn't primarily about treating cancer. The central question was military. How much radiation could a human body absorb and still remain functional? The research was framed in the context of nuclear warfare preparedness, specifically the need to understand soldier survivability in a radiological environment. Patients who consented to cancer treatment were, in effect, also consenting to a Defense Department study, though the military dimension of the research was not disclosed to them. The program was reviewed by a congressional subcommittee in the early 1970s. The ethical questions it raised contributed to the broader national conversation about research standards that was already underway by that point. That conversation had been a long time coming. 63. The apology that came in 1995. In 1995, President Clinton formally addressed the history of U.S. government radiation experiments on civilians, describing them as a fundamental betrayal of the ethical principles on which American medicine was built. An advisory committee had spent the preceding year reviewing thousands of pages of declassified documents and interviewing surviving subjects and their families. The findings confirmed the broad scope and the systemic nature of what had occurred. Here's the thing about the apology and what followed it. No criminal charges were brought. The physicians and administrators who had designed and carried out the experiments were, in most cases, no longer alive or no longer reachable through legal mechanisms. The institutional structures that had enabled the experiments had changed substantially. The apology acknowledged the wrong without producing legal accountability, which left many of the affected families in a complicated position, recognized but not remedied in any material sense. Recognition matters. It is not by itself the same as resolution. The distinction between those two things runs through a significant portion of American medical history, and this chapter is one of the clearer examples of it. 64. The institutions behind the research. One of the aspects of the government radiation experiments that took the longest to absorb publicly was the institutional prestige of the people involved. These were not, for the most part, rogue scientists working outside established systems. They were academic physicians affiliated with Harvard, MIT, and other major research universities, operating with federal funding, institutional approval, and the professional standing that came with both. Here's the thing about institutional prestige. It functions as a form of insulation. Scrutiny that might have been applied to a less credentialed researcher gets softened when the name of a respected institution is attached to the work. Peer review, oversight committees, and funding bodies all tend to extend more latitude to researchers whose credentials are familiar and whose institutional affiliations are trusted. The radiation experiments happened within that latitude. They were not underground operations. They were, in many cases, documented in academic literature. What they lacked was not documentation, but the ethical framework that, in a later era, would have required it. That framework was being built in real time, slowly, from the wreckage of cases exactly like these. 65. The reporter who found the files. The full scope of U.S. government radiation experiments on American civilians was not publicly known until 1993, when journalist Eileen Wellsome published an investigation in the Albuquerque Tribune identifying specific patients by name, real people with real families who had been injected with plutonium decades earlier and never told. She had spent years tracking down documents, cross-referencing records, and locating descendants of the original subjects. Here's the thing about what her reporting did. It converted a classified history into a human one. Government programs are abstract until they have names attached. The names Wellsome found made the experiments impossible to discuss in purely administrative terms. Her series won the Pulitzer Prize and directly prompted the Federal Advisory Committee review that preceded Clinton's 1995 apology. Wellsome's work is a reminder that the historical record doesn't complete itself automatically. It requires people willing to go looking, to sit in archives, read through documents that weren't meant to be read, and follow a thread until it leads somewhere that changes what everyone else understands. She followed that thread all the way through. 66, the doctor who believed in too much blood. Benjamin Rush was, by the measures of his era, one of the most distinguished physicians in American history. A signer of the Declaration of Independence. A founder of what would become American psychiatry. A professor, a writer, a public intellectual of genuine influence. He was also the most passionate advocate in early American medicine for aggressive bloodletting, and his approach to the practice was more intense than most of his contemporaries. Here's the thing about Rush's version of bloodletting. He believed in removing very large volumes of blood, far more than the already generous standard of the time, and he applied this approach across a wide range of conditions. His confidence in the treatment was absolute, and his public platform was enormous. Medical students trained under him. Physicians across the country read his publications. His influence on American medical practice extended well into the 19th century. Long after his death in 1813, the framework he championed was sincerely held and professionally authoritative. The distance between sincere authority and accurate medicine is one of the recurring themes of this entire history, and Rush illustrates it with particular clarity. 67. The cure that was worse than the disease. Mercury's long career in American medicine covered an uncomfortable amount of ground. Physicians prescribed it for syphilis throughout the 1800s, and it did have some effect against the bacterial infection, enough to sustain the treatment's credibility across generations of medical practice. But the doses required to produce any therapeutic benefit were close to the doses that produced serious harm, and the margin between the two was narrow enough that many patients experienced significant side effects before experiencing any relief. Here's the thing about the persistence of mercury as a treatment. It lasted not because physicians were indifferent to outcomes, but because syphilis was genuinely difficult to manage and the alternatives were limited. When a condition is severe enough and the available options are few enough, a treatment that works partially gets a great deal of tolerance. Mercury worked partially, and partially was better than nothing, and nothing was often the alternative. Penicillin wouldn't arrive as a syphilis treatment until the 1940s. Until then, mercury held its place in the pharmacopoeia through a combination of partial effectiveness, professional tradition, and the absence of anything better waiting to replace it. 68. The pharmacopoeia and the plant cannabis had been part of American pharmaceutical culture for nearly a century before its removal became a political project. Listed continuously in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia from 1851 through 1942, it was prescribed by physicians in tincture form for an array of conditions: headaches, muscle spasms, appetite loss, sleeplessness, and nervous complaints among them. Pharmacists dispensed it the way they dispensed other listed medicines: measured, bottled, labeled. Here's the thing about how it disappeared from the official reference. The process that removed cannabis from the Pharmacopoeia in 1942 was driven primarily by the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which imposed regulatory burdens that made prescribing it impractical. The decision was legislative and administrative rather than medical. No clinical evidence of harm to patients drove the removal. The plant didn't change. The political environment around it did. Physicians who had been prescribing cannabis tinctures for decades found themselves navigating a regulatory structure that made the practice effectively impossible, and the prescription stopped. Not because the medicine stopped working, but because the paperwork made it not worth it. 69. The pill that nearly crossed the ocean, thalidomide, caused some of the most heartbreaking birth defects documented in 20th century medicine. Approximately 10,000 children in Europe and elsewhere were affected. The United States was largely spared, but not entirely. During the late 1950s, an American pharmaceutical company had been distributing thalidomide to physicians across the country as part of clinical trials, under the category of investigational drug use. Women of childbearing age received it. Some were pregnant. Here's the thing about how the FDA managed the aftermath. When the connection between thalidomide and birth defects became clear in Europe, the agency had to locate every American physician who had received trial samples and track down every patient who had taken them. The process was slow and complicated. Some children born in the United States during that period did show effects consistent with thalidomide exposure. The number was small compared to Europe, but it was not zero. The story of thalidomide in America is usually told as a near miss. It was closer than that framing suggests, and the families who lived it experienced something closer to a direct hit. 70. The machine that saved and shaped a generation. In the early 1950s, polio was among the most feared diseases in the United States, not because it was always fatal, but because of what it could take from a person without taking their life. Children and adults who lost the ability to breathe independently could be kept alive by the iron lung, a large metal cylinder that surrounded the body and used changes in air pressure to assist breathing. Hospital wards during peak epidemic years held rows of these machines, each one occupied, the rhythmic mechanical sound filling the room day and night. Here's the thing about the iron lung's place in American medical history. It represents a genuine triumph of engineering applied to human need. Philip Drinker, a Harvard engineer, developed the device in 1927, and it saved thousands of lives in the decades that followed. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine, introduced in 1955, began reducing the disease's reach almost immediately. Within a decade, the wards that had been full were emptying. The machines that had breathed for so many people gradually went quiet, one by one, as the disease that had required them retreated. That particular kind of silence was a good one. The night is more than halfway through now, and so is this journey. If your breathing has found its own slow rhythm, if the chapters are arriving from somewhere softer than before, that's just right. History has a way of settling into you when you stop trying to hold it. Let it go where it wants. The next chapter will be here, patient and unhurried, whenever you're ready to drift toward it. 71. The surgery for pain that kept the patient aware. In the 1940s, a small number of American hospitals performed frontal lobe surgery specifically for patients suffering from severe chronic pain that hadn't responded to other treatments. The procedure was distinct from the standard lobotomy in its stated purpose. It wasn't aimed at altering mood or behavior, but at changing the patient's relationship to pain itself. The reported outcome was unusual. Patients described still being able to feel the sensation of pain, but finding that it no longer distressed them in the same way. The pain was present. The suffering it caused was reduced. Here's the thing about that distinction. It opened questions in neuroscience and philosophy that are still genuinely interesting today. What is pain exactly if the sensation and the suffering can be separated? What does it mean to feel something without being bothered by it? The procedure itself was rare and fell away as better pain management options developed. But the questions it raised about the relationship between sensation and experience didn't fall away with it. They traveled forward into neuroscience and are still being asked, in different forms, in research happening right now. 72. The convulsion that was the treatment. Electroconvulsive therapy arrived in American psychiatry in the late 1930s, introduced from European research as a potential intervention for severe depression and certain other psychiatric conditions. In its earliest American form, the procedure was administered without anesthesia and without muscle relaxants. The electrical current induced a full seizure. The physical response was intense enough that broken bones, most often vertebral fractures, occurred in some patients. Here's the thing about ECT's trajectory through American medical history. It didn't end with those early years. The procedure was refined. Anesthesia was added. Muscle relaxants reduced the physical severity of the seizure response. Monitoring improved. Modern electroconvulsive therapy, administered under anesthesia with careful protocols, is considered a legitimate and sometimes highly effective treatment for certain severe, treatment-resistant depressions. The early version and the current version share a name and a basic electrical mechanism, but the experience of receiving them was profoundly different. The history of ECT is one of the cleaner examples of a treatment that survived its own worst era by being substantially rebuilt. The idea retained, the application transformed. 73. The childbirth that was called painless twilight sleep was introduced to American obstetric practice in the 1910s and remained in use in various forms through the 1960s. The treatment combined morphine and scopolamine, the morphine for pain, the scopolamine for its amnesiac properties. Women who received it during labor remained conscious and responsive to pain throughout delivery. The scopolamine component, however, prevented the formation of lasting memories of the experience. Here's the thing about how this was marketed to expectant mothers. Hospitals described twilight sleep as a form of painless childbirth. The language was precise in a way that required careful reading. The pain was happening. The patient was experiencing it in real time, sometimes vocalizing it. The painless component referred to the absence of memory afterward, not the absence of the experience itself. Women who had heard that twilight sleep would spare them from suffering woke up having been spared from the memory of suffering, which is a meaningfully different thing. The procedure was widely popular for decades before its use declined. Women who had experienced it reported the absence of memory as a relief. What they couldn't report was what had happened while the memory was being prevented. 74. The program that ran for a decade. In the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency initiated a classified research program exploring whether the human mind could be influenced, controlled, or altered through chemical, psychological, and other means. The program, eventually known as MK-Ultra, ran for approximately a decade before being formally shut down. Among its methods was the administration of LSD to subjects, sometimes volunteers from specific populations, and in other cases, individuals who had not been informed they were participating in any kind of experiment. Here's the thing about MK-Ultra's reach. It extended into American military settings. Soldiers were among the populations who received LSD without their knowledge, as researchers attempted to understand the drug's effects on behavior, decision-making, and psychological resilience. Some participants experienced lasting psychological effects, so at least one death occurred in circumstances connected to the program. The program's existence wasn't publicly confirmed until Senate hearings in 1977, when documents that had survived a 1973 destruction order were reviewed by investigators. The hearing transcripts are publicly available. The story they tell is patient and specific and considerably stranger than fiction. 75. The last procedure and the revoked privileges. Walter Freeman performed his final lobotomy in 1967. By that point, antipsychotic medications had been available for more than a decade, offering psychiatric hospitals a chemical alternative to surgical intervention that was far less invasive and far more reversible. The broader medical community had largely moved on from the procedure Freeman had spent his career advancing. The patient he operated on in 1967 had received lobotomies from Freeman previously. This was a third procedure. She developed a brain hemorrhage following the operation and died. Freeman's hospital privileges were revoked shortly afterward. He retired. Here's the thing about the timing. 1967 is not ancient history. It's within the living memory of a significant portion of the population alive today. The lobotomy era didn't belong to some distant, pre-scientific past. It overlapped with color television, with the space program, with the civil rights movement. The procedures were happening in modern hospitals with modern equipment, performed by a physician who had spent decades refining his technique. The distance between that era and this one is shorter than it sometimes feels, which is part of why the history still carries weight. 76. The diploma that didn't mean much before the Flexner Report of 1910 prompted a sweeping reform of American medical education. The country had approximately 160 medical schools operating at wildly varying standards. Some were rigorous institutions attached to universities, with laboratory facilities and clinical training. Others were proprietary operations that admitted students, collected tuition, handed out diplomas, and sent graduates into practice with minimal preparation. Here's the thing about what a medical diploma meant in 1900. It meant someone had paid for one and completed whatever program the issuing institution required, which might have been 2 years or 1 year or something shorter still. No national licensing standard existed. No federal body verified that a practicing physician had received adequate training. Patients seeking medical care had no reliable way to assess the education behind the person treating them. The Flexner Report, commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation, documented this landscape in detail and recommended sweeping consolidation. By 1935, the 160 schools had been reduced to 66. The reform improved American medicine substantially. It also, as a consequence of consolidation, reduced access to medical education for women and Black Americans in ways that took generations to partially address. 77. The organization that opposed its own field's expansion. The American Medical Association spent significant portions of the 20th century in active opposition to proposals that would have extended medical coverage to more Americans. It campaigned against compulsory health insurance proposals in the 1910s and 20s. It opposed national health insurance legislation repeatedly through the mid-century decades. Its opposition to Medicare, the federal program providing health coverage for Americans over 65, was sustained and organized through the early 1960s, including a campaign called Operation Coffee Cup that recruited physician spouses to host discussion groups opposing the legislation. Here's the thing about the AMA's position. It was rooted in a coherent professional philosophy about the independence of medicine from government involvement, a philosophy shared by many physicians who held it sincerely. The debate about the proper relationship between medicine, government, and access to care is genuinely complex and wasn't resolved by Medicare's passage in 1965. What the history records is that the organization representing American physicians spent decades arguing against structures that millions of Americans eventually came to depend on. Medicare passed, the coffee cups were put away, and the coverage expanded, one enrollment at a time. 78. The agency that could only watch, for the first 32 years of its existence, the Food and Drug Administration had almost no power to remove a dangerous product from American shelves once it had been placed there. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act gave the agency the authority to require accurate labeling and to pursue fraud. It did not give the agency the authority to initiate a recall. If a product was causing harm, the FDA could document that harm, take the manufacturer to court, and hope the legal process moved faster than the damage was spreading. Here's the thing about what no recall authority means in practical terms. It means that between 1906 and 1938, when a product was discovered to be dangerous, the primary mechanism for getting it off shelves was litigation, voluntary withdrawal by the manufacturer, or waiting for public awareness to suppress demand. None of those mechanisms were fast. All of them left windows of continued exposure. The 1938 law that finally granted recall authority came, as so many regulatory expansions do, in the wake of a specific catastrophe, one that killed enough people quickly enough to make legislative action politically unavoidable. 79. The contract that bought silence. The arrangement between patent medicine manufacturers and American newspapers in the 1880s and 90s was in many cases more than a gentleman's understanding. Publishers who accepted advertising contracts from medicine companies sometimes signed agreements with explicit clauses. The advertising contract would be voided if the newspaper published content damaging to the patent medicine industry. The clause had a name in the trade. It was called a red clause or a poison clause, depending on the publication. Here's the thing about what that clause meant for the average reader. The newspaper they trusted to report on their community, their government, and their world had signed a document promising not to report honestly on one specific category of products. The reader didn't know about the clause. The reader saw the advertisement on one page and trusted the news on another, not knowing that the two were connected by a contract. Samuel Hopkins. Adams' 1905 investigation broke through that arrangement, partly because Collier's Weekly was financially independent enough to absorb the advertising losses that honest reporting would cause. Not every publication had that freedom. Most didn't. 80. The foundation money that built a movement. The American eugenics movement of the early 20th century was not a grassroots phenomenon. It was substantially funded and institutionally supported by some of the most prestigious philanthropic organizations in the country. The Carnegie Institution contributed to eugenics research programs. The Rockefeller Foundation provided funding to research facilities and international eugenics networks. Investments from the Harriman Railroad fortune supported organizations that lobbied for eugenics legislation at the state level. Here's the thing about that financial backing. It gave the eugenics movement a credibility and a reach it could not have achieved on its own. Research published with Carnegie affiliation carried weight in scientific and policy circles. Legislation proposed with the backing of recognized institutional funding moved differently through state houses than legislation without it. The ideas at the center of the movement were not scientifically sound, but they were dressed in the language of science and delivered through the infrastructure of respected institutions, which created an appearance of rigor that made them far more difficult to challenge than they deserved to be. The money didn't invent the ideas. It amplified them, housed them, and gave them an address that looked like authority. 80 chapters in, and the night has gone quiet around you. If the words have started to blur a little at the edges, if you've lost track of exactly where one chapter ended and the next began, that's not a problem. That's the whole idea. You don't have to hold on to any of it. Just let the history settle somewhere soft and drift the rest of the way down. There's nothing left to do tonight except rest. 81. The laws that traveled across an ocean. American eugenics legislation didn't stay within American borders. German scientists and legal scholars in the early 1930s studied American state sterilization statutes carefully. The laws passed in California, Virginia, Indiana, and elsewhere, and used them as explicit models when designing their own racial hygiene programs. American eugenicists were aware of this interest and, in several documented cases, expressed public approval of the early German programs in scientific journals and correspondence. Here's the thing about that transatlantic exchange. It wasn't clandestine. Papers were published. Conferences were held. Researchers on both sides of the Atlantic cited each other's work openly, within a shared professional framework that treated eugenics as legitimate science deserving of serious institutional attention. The programs diverged dramatically in scale and in the severity of what followed, but the intellectual and legal foundations that German racial science cited were, in meaningful part, American in origin. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with. It's also not a contested historical claim. It's documented in the records of the era, in the citations of the legislation, and in the correspondence of the researchers involved. 82. The study that ran for 40 years. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began a study in Macon County, Alabama, involving men who had syphilis. The study was designed to observe the natural progression of the disease, how it moved through the body over time, what it did to different organ systems, how the progression varied between individuals. The men enrolled were told they were being treated for a condition called bad blood, a local term covering a range of ailments. They were not being treated, they were being observed. Here's the thing about how long that observation continued. 40 years. The study ran from 1932 to 1972, crossing 4 decades, multiple presidential administrations, and one enormously significant medical development. Penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in 1947. The men in the study were not offered it. The observation continued. Researchers made deliberate efforts to ensure participants didn't receive treatment from other sources, including working with local draft boards during World War II to prevent the men from accessing military medical care that might have treated their condition. The study ended not because it concluded, but because it was exposed. 83. The whistleblower who tried twice. Peter Buxton was a public health researcher who became aware of the details of the Tuskegee syphilis study in the mid-1960s. He filed a formal written complaint with the Centers for Disease Control in 1966, raising ethical concerns about the study's continuation and the withholding of treatment from participants. The CDC convened a review committee. The committee voted to continue the study. Buxton filed a second complaint in 1968. Another review was conducted. The study continued. Here's the thing about those 2 failed attempts. They went through official channels, to the people with the authority to act, and were considered and declined. Buxton eventually made a different decision. In 1972, he shared documents from the study with journalist John Heller of the Associated Press. Her story ran in July of that year and produced immediate national attention. Congressional hearings followed. The study was terminated within months of publication. Buxton's 2 formal complaints had been absorbed by the system without producing change. A newspaper story accomplished in weeks what official review had declined to do across 6 years. The lesson about the relationship between institutional review and public accountability has not lost its relevance. 84. The apology that came in 1997. In 1997, President Clinton met with the 8 surviving participants of the Tuskegee syphilis study at a White House ceremony and offered a formal presidential apology on behalf of the United States government. The apology acknowledged that what had been done was deeply wrong, that the men had been deceived, that treatment had been withheld, and that the study had violated every standard of ethical research. 8 men remained alive to receive it. The study had enrolled 399 men with syphilis and 201 as a control group over 40 years. Here's the thing about the study's legacy that extends beyond the men who were directly involved. Research has documented that awareness of the Tuskegee study is associated with measurably lower rates of preventive healthcare engagement among Black men in communities where the study is well known. The harm didn't end with the study's termination. It traveled forward through generations, through memory, through an entirely rational wariness about medical institutions that had demonstrably failed to protect people who looked like them. Trust, once broken at that scale, doesn't repair itself on the timeline of a formal apology. 85. The muddy 5% figure. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, American pharmaceutical companies conducted drug trials using prison inmates as test subjects. Shui, the arrangement had a practical logic from the industry's perspective. Incarcerated populations were accessible, available for extended monitoring, and could be compensated with small amounts of money that represented meaningful value within the prison economy. A 1962 survey found that 85% of all new drugs introduced in the United States had been tested on prison inmates at some point in their development. Here's the thing about consent in a carceral setting. It carries a structural problem that ethical researchers today recognize clearly. A person who is incarcerated, whose daily circumstances, privileges, and sometimes release prospects are controlled by the institution housing them, cannot freely decline a request from that institution in the same way a person outside those walls can. The word voluntary gets complicated when the context around it removes meaningful alternatives. The practice was widespread, professionally accepted, and institutionally convenient. It was also, as the ethical standards of research evolved through the 1970s, increasingly recognized as incompatible with genuine, informed consent. Reform came gradually through new federal research regulations. 86. The pregnant women in the trials. Thalidomide's American story has one more layer that rarely gets full attention. When the drug was being distributed to American physicians as an investigational compound in the late 1950s, the distribution was not accompanied by adequate tracking systems. Physicians received samples. Patients received the drug. Documentation of who received what was inconsistent. Here's the thing about what the FDA faced when European reports of birth defects began arriving. They needed to find every American physician who had received trial samples, determine which patients had been given the drug, identify which of those patients had been pregnant, and reach all of them before they delivered, if possible. That process took months. Records were incomplete. Some physicians had distributed samples without maintaining the documentation that would have allowed tracing. Women who had taken the drug during early pregnancy, the period of greatest developmental vulnerability, were difficult to locate through the existing paperwork. Some children born in the United States during that window did show effects associated with thalidomide exposure. The near misframing that dominates most American accounts of thalidomide is accurate in aggregate. At the individual level, for specific families in specific cities, it was something closer to a direct experience with consequences that arrived without warning. 87. The doctor who was mocked and then proven right. Ignaz Semmelweis spent years trying to convince the medical establishment of his era that physicians washing their hands before delivering babies could prevent the deaths of new mothers from puerperal fever, a bacterial infection that killed women in maternity wards at devastating rates in the mid-19th century. He had data. He had a comparison group. He had outcomes that demonstrated the difference clearly. So, the medical establishment of his era largely rejected his conclusions, in some cases with open hostility. Here's the thing about why the rejection happened. Semmelweis's findings implied something that many physicians found deeply uncomfortable: that doctors themselves were carrying the cause of the infections from patient to patient. Accepting the hand-washing conclusion meant accepting a kind of responsibility that the professional culture of the time was not prepared to absorb. Semmelweis was committed to a mental institution in 1865. He died there shortly afterward from an infection, likely the same kind he had spent his career working to prevent. Germ theory, confirmed by Pasteur and Lister in the years that followed, vindicated everything he had argued. The vindication arrived after he was gone, which is not the ending the story deserved, but it is the ending the history records. 88. The American surgeons and the dirt they trusted Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgical technique to Britain in the 1860s, demonstrating through careful documentation that treating wounds and surgical sites with antiseptic solution reduced infection rates dramatically. His results were published, his methods were detailed, his outcomes were clear. Here's the thing about how American surgeons received this information. Many of them didn't for years. Suggestion that American conditions were simply different from European ones. That American hospitals and American patients didn't require the same precautions because American dirt was inherently less problematic than its European equivalent. That argument was made by practicing physicians with medical degrees and professional reputations. It was wrong, demonstrably and measurably wrong, and patients who underwent surgery during the period of resistance to antiseptic technique paid the cost of that wrongness in infection rates that could have been reduced. Lister's methods eventually prevailed in American practice, not through a single persuasive argument, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that antiseptic technique produced better outcomes. The evidence won. It just took longer than it should have. 89. The Georgia doctor nobody believed Crawford Long was a physician practicing in Jefferson, Georgia, who used ether as a surgical anesthetic for the first time in 1842. He administered it to a patient named James Venable for the removal of a small neck cyst. The patient felt nothing during the procedure. Long used ether again for subsequent small surgeries over the following years, observing and documenting the results with care. He didn't publish his findings. Here's the thing about what happened 4 years later. In 1846, a demonstration at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston introduced surgical ether anesthesia to the wider medical world, and that demonstration received the credit, the attention, and the historical recognition. When Long eventually published his documentation of the earlier use, the response from the medical community was skeptical. The Georgia records were questioned. The Boston demonstration had already been absorbed into the origin story. Long spent years attempting to establish his priority and was never fully successful in his own lifetime. The historical record today acknowledges his 1842 use, but the Massachusetts General Demonstration of 1846 remains the more recognized moment. Geography and publication timing shaped medical history in a way that the actual sequence of events did not. 90. The surgeon who kept the medal. Mary Walker was a physician who served as a surgeon during the Civil War, one of the very few women to do so, and was captured by Confederate forces and held as a prisoner of war. After the war, she received the Medal of Honor for her service, becoming the first and, to date, only woman to receive that distinction. Here's the thing about what happened to that medal decades later. In 1917, a review board conducted an audit of Medal of Honor recipients and revoked the medals of more than 900 individuals, including Walker, on the grounds that the original awards hadn't met revised eligibility criteria. Walker refused to return hers. She wore it every day for the rest of her life, continuing to appear in public with it pinned to her coat despite the revocation. She died in 1919, still wearing it, still unacknowledged by the military that had taken back its recognition. In 1977, President Carter restored her medal posthumously, reinstating the honor the review board had removed 60 years earlier. Walker never knew about the restoration. She had already made her position on the matter entirely clear, one daily public appearance at a time. 91. The founder with the complicated record. Florence Nightingale transformed nursing from an informal and often poorly regarded occupation into a structured, trained profession, with standards, documentation practices, and a coherent educational pathway. Her work during the Crimean War, her statistical innovations in public health visualization, and her founding of the first secular nursing school in London in 1860 are genuine and lasting contributions to medicine. Here's the thing about her full historical record: it contains significant racial bias, expressed in her writings and in the professional structures she built. She worked actively to limit the participation of Black nurses in the profession she was establishing. Her views on race reflected the imperial thinking of Victorian Britain and were not incidental to her work. They shaped the boundaries of who she believed nursing was for and who she believed it should serve. Both things are true simultaneously. The professional contribution was real, and the exclusions she built into it were also real. Holding both parts of that record is more accurate than emphasizing one and erasing the other. History rarely offers figures whose contributions arrive without complication, and Nightingale is one of its clearer illustrations of that pattern. 92. The statue and the name behind it. For decades, a statue of James Marion Sims stood in Central Park in New York City, positioned near the medical district where much of his later work took place. Sims is credited with developing the surgical repair for vesico-vaginal fistula, a procedure that has helped many women. The statue honored that contribution. What the statue didn't represent was the full context of how the knowledge behind that contribution was developed. Through repeated experimental surgeries performed on enslaved women in Alabama without anesthesia between 1845 and 1849. Here's the thing about the debate that eventually led to the statue's removal in 2018. It wasn't a debate about whether the medical contribution was real. It was a debate about what public commemoration means and whose experience gets centered in the story a monument tells. The women on whom Sims operated, including a woman named Anyarcha, who underwent approximately 30 surgeries, were not commemorated anywhere in the original installation. The removal of the statue didn't erase Sims from medical history. It ended a specific form of public honor that many people argued he hadn't earned on the terms the monument implied. 93. The blood that had no color. During World War II, the American Red Cross implemented a policy of segregating blood donations by race, maintaining separate supplies of blood labeled by the racial identity of the donor. The policy continued from 1941 to 1950. Blood plasma has no biological characteristics linked to race. The segregation had no scientific basis whatsoever. Here's the thing about the timing of that policy. It was implemented despite, and in some accounts in partial response to, the work of Dr. Charles Drew, a Black physician whose research on blood storage and plasma preservation had essentially made large-scale blood banking possible. Drew's work was foundational to the blood supply systems the Red Cross was operating. He served briefly as director of the Blood for Britain Project and the first American Red Cross blood bank. The institution that relied on his scientific contributions simultaneously maintained a policy of racial segregation in the blood supply he had helped create. Drew died in 1950 following a car accident in North Carolina. Some early accounts suggested he was denied emergency care at a segregated hospital, though historians have disputed the details of those accounts. The documented facts alone, without the disputed elements, carry enough weight to stand on their own. 94. The woman who built a field with no budget. Alice Hamilton arrived at Harvard in 1919 as the first woman appointed to the faculty, a distinction that came with a specific set of conditions, including exclusion from the faculty club and from the commencement procession. She accepted the appointment anyway and spent the years before and after it doing work that essentially created the field of occupational medicine in America. So here's the thing about how she did it. Without a laboratory budget, without institutional staff support, and without the research infrastructure that her male colleagues took for granted, she investigated the relationship between industrial toxins and worker illness by going directly to the source. She walked into factories, talked to workers, interviewed foremen, and documented what she found with a kind of systematic precision that produced findings impossible to dismiss. Her reports on lead poisoning in industrial settings, on carbon monoxide exposure in steel plants, on the health effects of various manufacturing processes became the foundation of American workplace safety law. She did it with shoe leather and a notebook in environments that weren't designed to welcome her, producing research that outlasted every obstacle placed in front of it. The field she built is now called occupational medicine. Her name rarely appears in its introductory textbooks. 95. The neighborhood doctor who changed the numbers, Sarah Josephine Baker, took a position with the New York City Health Department in 1902 and was eventually assigned to one of the most densely populated and medically underserved neighborhoods in the country, Hell's Kitchen on the west side of Manhattan. The infant mortality rate in that neighborhood was among the highest in the city. Baker's approach was systematic and grounded in direct community engagement. So, she hired immigrant women from the neighborhood as nurses and sent them into apartment buildings to teach basic hygiene, safe feeding practices, and newborn care in the languages the residents actually spoke. Here's the thing about what happened to the numbers over the next 15 years. The infant mortality rate in Hell's Kitchen dropped by 75% between 1908 and 1923. That is not a modest improvement. It is a transformation, achieved without new drugs, without surgical innovation, and without significant additional funding. Baker went on to found the Division of Child Hygiene for New York City, the first such government agency in the world. She wrote extensively, trained other public health workers, and spent decades building the infrastructure of child health in America. She remains, as the research document for this series noted, almost entirely absent from standard medical school curricula. 96. The Justice and the Two Opinions. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. occupies a particular position in American legal history. Celebrated for landmark opinions defending free speech and civil liberties, studied in law schools as an example of rigorous constitutional reasoning, remembered as one of the more intellectually formidable figures ever to sit on the Supreme Court. He also wrote the majority opinion in Buck v. Bell in 1927, upholding forced sterilization of Americans deemed unfit by the state. Here's the thing about holding both parts of that record simultaneously. It's uncomfortable, and the discomfort is productive. Holmes was not a different person when he wrote Buck v. Bell than when he wrote his civil liberties opinions. The same mind produced both. He never expressed public regret about the sterilization ruling. He appears, from the available record, to have considered it consistent with his broader legal philosophy rather than a departure from it. History has a way of presenting its most significant figures as coherent wholes, with their complicated elements quietly subordinated to the parts that are easiest to teach. Holmes resists that simplification, and the resistance is, in its own way, a more honest account of how intelligent people and flawed conclusions can arrive in the same place at the same time. 97. The decade that kept going. Forced sterilization under American eugenics law did not end when the broader cultural conversation about eugenics shifted. It did not end when Nazi Germany's programs became internationally condemned. It did not end when the scientific community increasingly distanced itself from eugenics as a legitimate discipline. In Oregon, the last forced sterilization carried out under a state eugenics statute occurred in 1981. The law authorizing it wasn't formally repealed until 1983. Here's the thing about those dates. 1981 is not a historical abstraction. People who were alive in 1981 are alive right now, listening to this. The eugenics era is not ancient history sealed off from the present by a comfortable distance of centuries. It extended into the decade of MTV and personal computers and space shuttles. The person sterilized in Oregon in 1981 was a real individual whose life was altered by a law that had been on the books since the eugenics movement wrote it there, surviving long past the ideology that had produced it, waiting in the legal code for someone to finally take it off the shelf. That removal came in 1983. It came late, 98. The Pulitzer and the files nobody was meant to find. Eileen Wellsome was a journalist working for the Albuquerque Tribune when she began tracing a footnote, a passing reference to human subjects in a declassified document about radiation research. The footnote contained no names, no context, no acknowledgement of the people behind the notation. Wellsome decided to find them. The search took years. It required cross-referencing medical records, hospital logs, government documents, and death certificates across multiple states. Here's the thing about what she found. Names. Real names belonging to real people with families and histories and descendants who were alive and had no idea their relatives had been part of the secret government experiment decades earlier. She found those families and told them what had happened. Her series, published in 1993, won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Reporting and directly prompted the Federal Advisory Committee review that led to President Clinton's formal apology 2 years later. The story existed in the files the whole time. It required someone willing to read carefully enough, persist long enough, and follow a footnote all the way to the people it referred to. Wellsome followed it. The history that resulted is one of the more important pieces of American medical journalism ever published. 99. The long way to where we are. American medicine today operates within a framework of informed consent, ethical review boards, clinical trial protocols, and regulatory oversight that would be largely unrecognizable to the physicians of a century ago. That framework didn't arrive fully formed. It was built piece by piece from the wreckage of the things that went wrong, from the patent medicines, the radiation experiments, the surgical abuses, the studies that ran 4 decades without telling anyone the truth. Every protection that exists now exists because someone at some point was harmed by the absence of it. Here's the thing about knowing this history. It doesn't make medicine less trustworthy. If anything, it clarifies what the trustworthiness is actually built on. It was built on people who asked hard questions, on journalists who followed footnotes, on whistleblowers who filed complaints twice and then went to the press, on patients who took their cases to court when they had almost nothing left. It was built slowly, imperfectly, on the accumulated weight of hard-won lessons. The building is still ongoing. The history that got us here is strange and difficult and occasionally almost impossible to believe. And every word of it is true. So tonight, rest easy knowing you live in a time when your drinking water isn't being energized overnight in a ceramic crock full of radium ore, when no one is handing you a bottle of Radithor and calling it perpetual sunshine, when a man named Walter Freeman is not traveling state to state in a van performing 10-minute procedures with a mallet and an ice pick. 99 true stories, every single one of them verified, every single one of them real, and not one of them from a world as distant as it might feel right now. The history was strange. The people inside it were just people. And the distance between their medicine cabinet and yours is, in the largest sense, remarkably short. Sleep well. The past is resting too.